Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Treehouse of Horror 2. This is a yearly tradition where every year I review a different Treehouse of Horror episode in chronological order, and now I've come to the second one. It's a new tradition, but I think it's a cool one. This one is probably most famous for the fact that it is the first Treehouse of Horror to have the scary names in the credits, which you can probably thank your spooky Twitter name for and all that stuff. I do like that being in there. It's like kind of one of the better traditions. They just started with this one and kept going. This one is a little different from the first one in that it has one director. The other one had three for each different segment. This one directed by just Jim Reardon. And I think this one has never been my necessarily favorite. I think when I was growing up, at least I had more of a fondness for 1 or 3 or like the first 5 or 6. This is probably more one that I was never as into. I don't remember watching it as many times. It's still a really good Treehouse of Horror. You know, it's the second one. We're still like, this is season 3 because there wasn't Treehouse of Horror in season 1, so that's sort of how it works. If you want to know what season you're on, it's like one more than the Treehouse of Horror, I guess. This episode obviously contains 3 stories and it has one wraparound segment. This one being after the Simpsons come back from a night of trick-or-treating. Homer, Lisa, and Bart start eating a ton of candy after Marge is like, now only have one before bedtime, and is worried that they will have nightmares. And of course, each segment is a different character's nightmare, which is alright, I guess. I think it's sort of a lame wraparound segment because it's like it works for like a horror anthology thing, but it's not necessarily like too spooky. Probably my least favorite of the classic wraparound segments. It's just like, I mean, I guess they had nightmares. I don't know. They didn't really play off of like dream logic. It was just sort of like 3 tales. I mean, you could just have like another thing, but whatever. I do like though the continuity of Marge coming out again, a reference to Frankenstein, and Marge comes out and says, "You didn't listen to me last year." And that again plays both as a reference and to the fact that still at this time parents would not let their kids watch The Simpsons. It was considered controversial. Never really understood that, but it actually was. I was a kid then. My parents did let me watch The Simpsons. And I think I watched this episode when it aired. I used to do Treehouse of Horror marathons and actually air all of them when there weren't that many on Fox, in fact. And I remember seeing this. Maybe I didn't see this when it aired because it aired on Halloween and I was a kid and I was probably out trick-or-treating, so I missed this. So I probably didn't get to see it until there was like a marathon that wasn't on Halloween or a marathon that happened after I got home for trick-or-treating. Okay, you know what? Now I understand why I didn't. I always thought, oh, I probably did. But then I remember like seeing it in reruns and stuff and like really feeling like I had seen it. And I was like, but I probably did, but I didn't. There's no way. I was a kid. I was out trick-or-treating. So I didn't get to see it, I guess. Each segment kind of always tries to do a different Simpson, tries to do a different sort of tale. So it works within that. And it's not horrible. It's kind of like just a little like, it's just a little lame. The first is the one based on the Monkey Paw short story written by W.W. Jacobs and was in what was called the New Twilight Zone, which I don't know the New Twilight Zone is. That it was an 80s series that predated this, so mainly this is off of the story The Monkey's Paw, which I really didn't know was actually a short story. I just thought it was like a tale that sort of everybody knew. I don't know. Sorry. It's not. It's the one of these that doesn't really have as many movie references. It does have a reference to Midnight Express, which sort of doesn't really make any sense, to be honest with you, but is a cool little reference. Instead of the character smuggling drugs, which happened in Midnight Express, Homer is smuggling souvenirs and just pays $2 American. I actually have not seen Midnight Express, but I kind of think this one has a lot of segments that are sort of killing time. Like Kang and Kodos laugh way too long. While I was watching, I was like, why are they laughing so long? And then I read that it was meant to like sort of make sure you fit in time. And I can say this as like, I have a TV show, if you didn't know, even though it's public access, but all shows on TV you basically have this rule that's like, you have to be within, you can't go over this time, but you have to be over this time. And it's like, whatever time, whatever length your show is or whatever, and every network has that kind of thing. And you can't be too short, but you also can't be too long. And it's sometimes difficult, and it's interesting. If you ever do get a chance to work on a TV show or anything, you'll understand that sometimes you have to make sacrifices and have to extend things. And The Simpsons became masters at it later. Like the rake joke is probably the most famous, and you can get creative with it, but there are times when you finished an episode and you're like, oh shit, oh shit. So I think I think that is precisely what happened with the Kang Kodos thing. The Monkey's Paw one, I generally like that, and that one's like creepy and spooky, and I like the satirical idea of the Simpsons criticizing the fact that they were just probably the marketing, probably not calming down, but their merchandise was fucking everywhere at the time, so it's sort of interesting that then you sort of make fun of that in a way. I like Get a Mammogram Man. I think that's funny. Why they haven't actually done that? I think people would like that now, maybe. I don't know. Probably not. That was very funny, actually. Them kind of criticizing themselves of how huge the Simpsons were in the early 90s, because the Simpsons are now like always huge, but at the time when they first came out, it was just a marketing bonanza. It was ridiculous. It's funny for them to make fun of that, the world peace thing, and how it led to certain things. That was probably the best written, because it's like this leads to this, which leads to this, which leads to this, which is traditionally good writing. Moving on to the next segment, which is a parody of the Twilight Zone episode It's a Good Life, which is a really famous episode and is insanely scary. Like most kids, I saw this Simpsons segment before I saw the Twilight Zone episode. A really scary episode, It's a Good Life. It was then remade as part of Twilight Zone, the movie. It did have Nancy Cartwright in it in her acting film debut in that segment, interestingly enough. That one's always been kind of a favorite of mine as a kid. I like how it does get kind of the horror of that story while also being very funny and taking elements and direct imagery from it and making it funny and sillier, I think is something The Simpsons is really good and smart. That was a good choice, I think, especially for Bart, and it was a good story to do. I love the horror story elements of this. That's something I said this in the last one, but I hate when they like got away from horror stories and doing just like random movie parodies like this. Like as a kid, like this is how I got told these scary stories. I don't think I'm scared by them. I'm not scared by them now, but as a kid I was, because that's how you heard this information. It's how you heard this story, so it felt way spookier. I both always thought of it as from Bart's perspective and from everyone else's perspective, and I think of it more now from everyone else's perspective because I'm not a 10-year-old boy. One part I always find interesting about this episode is when Homer's watching football and then Bart wants to watch Krusty. And there's a lot of interesting world building in this whole segment. But in this show, there's a lot of world building in this, like how when he says it's called Bonerland or Bonerville, the psychiatrist's door later becomes Bonerville, which I think is really funny. That it's like that they have this whole infrastructure set up to take care of Bart. But then in that episode where Homer's watching football, Homer disappears and suddenly the football becomes Homer. And then they, and whenever something strange happens, we say it's good because of Bart and all this stuff. It's like in the Twilight Zone episode, it's just like this small town, but like how many people know this kid has these powers? Like how far has this really gone? Is interesting. And then the Krusty the Clown being on like forever and ever, that's just like horrific. And I was also like, that kid like sleeps. You could just like, I don't know. They could maybe like do some more infrastructure to like let Krusty sleep, I think. I just think it's like unfortunate for him. Anyway, so the final one, and which is Homer's Nightmare. First one was Lisa's, the second one was Bart's. Final one's Homer's Nightmare. Homer's Nightmare is obviously a big reference to Frankenstein and the thing with two heads. It's basically that Mr. Burns wants to make a robo-employee, and since he has just fired Homer just as a random firing, and finds Homer in an open grave because Homer has become a grave digger and then fell asleep. Then it's nighttime or something, and then Mr. Burns finds him and thinks he's dead, and yeah. There's a lot of kind of giant leaps in this one, and this one's far goofier than the other ones, especially like Mr. Burns like doing things with a shovel and dancing around is suddenly like way more animated, and I know it's a bad term to use, but movable and flexible in this one. And then suddenly like when the thing's falling, he's really slow. It seemed a little odd to me, but it's a dream, so maybe we'll just only use the dream logic for this. I don't know. This one's probably my least favorite, but at the same time it gets more into the EC Comics kind of thing that the original did so well at. It gets closer to that basically, and in the classic EC sense, but it's never been one I loved as much as the other two. I mean I did think him being stuck with Mr. Burns was like pretty scary and pretty funny. I love the segment where he's like, but Homer, we have to go see the princess or something, and he wants to go to a spaghetti dinner. Like if you made a sitcom out of The Man with Two Heads. I thought that was really, really funny. Treehouse of Horror 2 is, I still think, a really good Treehouse of Horror. If they aired this now, I would be like, oh my god, they're so much better than they normally are. But at the same time, I think Treehouse of Horror 2, it's getting the scariness of it in certain ones, but it's not really getting into the mood as much, you know. This was always one that I watched when I'd watch those marathons. I did eventually see it go from, you know, being the second episode to the first episode to them not do Treehouse of Horror marathons anymore. I still think this is a very good Treehouse of Horror. It's one that's good in a marathon. I don't think it's one like 1 and 3, 4, and 5 are ones that I, and 6 and so forth, I would watch like by themselves. This has never been one I've watched not in a marathon. In fact, this, other than like when The Simpsons first came in syndication or something, this might be one of the few times I've done that with this episode. Even though I've seen this episode probably a ton of times because I watched The Simpsons a lot, especially those classic first couple seasons. This is still a funny one. I still had a great time. I think markedly, probably the best one is Bart's Nightmare, which is the takeoff on It's a Good Life. I think that is probably the best segment of these. I like the Monkey's Paw one. I'd probably say the second, and then the Homer Frankenstein robot thing, I'd probably go last. I think what really hurts the Monkey's Paw one is all the stuff they had to do to extend the episode is a little rough. But at the same time, I like all they're doing with the morals and the kind of the scary thing and Homer getting the turkey sandwich and all that stuff. This is still a hilarious episode. I had a wonderful time revisiting it. And I think if you are going to watch Treehouse of Horror episodes, this would probably be in the topper tier anyway. It's just probably the lower in the topper tier, and not one that's ever really been a personal favorite, but one that I still look back on fondly in those original bunch of seasons, and one that really gets the true spirit of Treehouse of Horror, even if it isn't one of my favorite Treehouse of Horrors. So if you have seen Treehouse of Horror 2 and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. One thing, and this is a big one here, guys, so I saved this for the end. Anyway, while I was like researching this, I of course have this book, like any true Simpsons fan from the 90s did. And I noticed at first, when I looked at the air dates, which are at the top here, it says air date January 31st. Can we see that? January 31st, 1991. And in fact, it aired on Halloween. So it is a misprint. I noticed a misprint. I noticed it. I'm glad I recorded that because no one except the internet and the people who watch the end of my videos will care. Alright, thank you very much for watching. Have a happy Halloween.